Chapter 2, The Empress. Wundt's second major contribution to psychology's preempting of education wasn't theoretical at all. He produced the first generation of researchers, professors, and publicists in the new psychology. This group went on to establish experimental psychology throughout Europe and the United States. Through these students, the Leipzig Laboratory exercised an immense influence on the development of psychology. It served as the model for the many new laboratories that were developed in the latter part of the 19th century. The many students who flocked to Leipzig, united as they were in point of view and common purpose, constituted a school of thought in psychology. The list of Wundt's students is a who's who of early European and American psychologists. In succeeding years, one could go to almost any major European or American university and study psychology with a professor who had received his PhD directly from Wundt at Leipzig. Naturally, Leipzig became the mecca of students who wished to study the new psychology, a psychology that was no longer a branch of speculative philosophy, no longer a fragment of the science of physiology, but a novel and daring and exciting attempt to study mental processes by the experimental and quantitative methods common to all science. For the psychology of Leipzig was, in the 80s and 90s, the newest thing under the sun. It was a psychology for young, bold radicals who believed that the ways of the mind could be measured and treated experimentally, and who possibly thought of themselves in their private reflections as pioneers on the newest frontier of science, pushing its methods into reaches of experience that it had never before invaded. At any rate, they threw themselves into their task with industry and zest. They became trained introspectionists and adding introspection to the resources of their physiological laboratories. They attempted the minute analysis of sensation and perception. They measured reaction times, following their problems into numerous and widespread ramifications. They investigated verbal reactions, thus extending their research into the field of association. They measured the span and the fluctuations of attention and noted some of its more complex features in the complication experiment, a laboratory method patterned after the situation that gave rise to the astronomer's problem of the personal equation. In their studies of feeling and emotion, they recorded pulse rates, breathing rates, and fluctuations in muscular strength, and in the same connection, they developed methods of recording systematically and treating statistically the impressions observed by introspection. They also developed the psychophysical methods and in addition made constant use of resources of the physiological laboratory, and throughout all their endeavors, they were dominated by the conception of a psychology that should be scientific as opposed to speculative. Also, they attempted to rely on exact observation, experimentation, and measurement. Finally, when they left Leipzig and worked in laboratories of their own, chiefly in American or German universities, most of them retained enough of the Leipzig impress to teach psychology that whatever the subsequent development of the individual's thought bore traces of the system which was recognized at Leipzig as orthodox. What I want to do here briefly is I'd like to go back over one of the parts from page 13. And I'm just going to go back over and read this again about Wundt and his students and the things they studied. It says, they became trained introspectionists. So they're observing everything inwardly about you. They learn how to do this over time. And it said they were adding introspection to the resources of the physiological laboratories. So again, they study everything about you. It says they attempted the minute analysis of sensation and perception. They measured reaction times, following their problems into numerous and widespread ramifications. Again, every single nuance of a person, they went over that. It says they investigated verbal reactions, thus extending their research into the field of association. They measured the span and the fluctuation of attention and noted some of its more complex features in the complication experiment, a laboratory method patterned after the situation that gave rise to the astronomer's problem of the personal equation. Now, if y'all want to know more about the personal equation, y'all can look that up. It's nothing complicated. And if y'all want to look up the complication experiment, again, that's nothing real complicated. I'm not really going to harp on that. But what my thing is with this is that I had a friend who I would talk to about various things about psychology, and one of them was MK Ultra, known as the MK Ultra experiments, the government mind control program that took place at colleges and universities and hospitals and jails and different hospitals, even in Canada. And she said that she was aware of all the different things that people have done, but from her professor's standpoint and other things she could read, that this type of thing where you're studying each and every last little nuance about a person is very invasive and can be unethical. And that's the point. When does this sort of thing go overboard? When do you know too much about someone? And what are you going to do with that information once you get it? Because if I know how you're going to react to everything that I do, I got you under control. Again, that's mind control. Point blank, period. I've studied everything about you. I know how to make you move when I want you to move, like a puppet. I can treat you like a puppet with some words, and I perform some actions, and then you give a reaction. I got you. It's a wrap. And they still do that type of stuff today. It's not a secret. Just go look up mind control, MK Ultra. Y'all will see some real things that happen around the world. Other places did it too. Germany was a good hub for mind control. Of course, that's where Wundts and his people were studying at, right? So go figure. Mind control. It's a big deal. Adding on to the studies that they perform, it says in their studies of feeling and emotion, they recorded pulse rates, breathing rates, and fluctuations in muscular strength. And in the same connection, they developed methods of recording systematically and treating statistically the impressions observed by introspection. What is it that these people didn't do? They also developed the psychophysical methods and, in addition, made constant use of resources of the physiological laboratory. So they didn't run out of space to do whatever they felt like they needed to do, whatever it was. And throughout all their endeavors, they were dominated by the conception of a psychology that should be scientific as opposed to speculative. Always they attempted to rely on exact observation, experimentation, and measurement. So, they wanted it to be scientific, not speculative. Meaning that, again, you can kind of lie with your mouth. If you just lie with your mouth and you just telling lies, they would never know. That's why they studied your body as well, to see what your body was doing in accordance with the things that came out of your mouth. The young Americans who studied with Wundt returned to found departments of psychology throughout the United States. With the prestige attached to having studied in Germany, these men found little difficulty in securing positions of influence at major universities. Each became successful to a marked degree. Each trained scores, often hundreds of PhD students in psychology. Each contributed to new associations and publications in the new field of study. Almost without exception, every one of them became involved in another field which lay open to the advance of German psychology, the field of education. The first of Wundts American students to return to the United States was G. Stanley Hall. Returning from Leipzig in 1883, he joined the faculty of Baltimore's new Johns Hopkins University, which was being established after the model of the great German universities. Hall organized a psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins and in 1887 established the American Journal of Psychology, giving the adherents of the new psychology not only a storehouse for contribution, both experimental and theoretical, but a sense of solidarity and independence. Adding on to the psychology laboratory that Hall made at Johns Hopkins, but then he also had established the American Journal of Psychology. And so, as it says, the adherents had a storehouse for contributions, both experimental and theoretical, and had a sense of solidarity and independence. You know, it's important that you build with those who have like viewpoints. At least for what you're trying to build, you can always establish things quicker. You won't have arguments about everything, you know what I mean? Because you guys will be seeing things alike. It's important when you're building things that you build things on a like level. Everything's on the square, at least as far as you and your team are concerned. If you keep building like that, you almost can't go wrong. They keep funding each other. You put your money into each other. You speak with each other. You consistently make all these different publications. All of Wundts students started to become publicists for each other. No matter what university they were, no matter what job they had, wherever they were, you speak up for each other. You have each other's back. That's a solid foundation, again, for them wanting to change the meaning of education. Remember, because that's really what they were after. Even as a group, they were out to establish the change of education. And I'll show you guys that a little later on. Well, with just a few pictures of these people and some of the ideas that they had. I'll include that later. Back to the reading. 2 years later, in 1889, when Clark University was established in Worcester, Massachusetts, Hall was chosen to be its first president. In 1892, he played a leading role in founding the American Psychological Association. Hall became known for his intensive studies of child development, which directly fostered the child movement in this country. And in 1904, he published his masterwork, the 2-volume Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relation to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. Wedding Experimental Psychology to Child Education. Let's pause. Pause for the cause. What is it that's so important that these brothers also wanted to know everything about the physiology of children and how that relates to the psychology and things that they're thinking? Look, the sociology, education, religion, crime, sex, crime. Lord have mercy. It's not anything, like I've said before, that these guys didn't want to know about you. And they were going to find out too. Believe it. Hall was also instrumental in furthering the career of a man who was to have an unusual, profound effect on the course of American education. John Dewey. John Dewey was born in Vermont, graduated from the University of Vermont, spent a little over 2 years teaching high school, and enrolled as a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, following in the footsteps of his older brother by 1.5 years, Davis Rich Dewey, who later became professor of economics and statistics at MIT, and who was, for 29 years, managing editor of the American Economic Review. He spent a year studying under Hall and received his doctorate from Johns Hopkins in 1884. He taught for 10 years at the University of Michigan in Minnesota, and in 1886, the same year the National Education Association was formed. While a professor at Michigan, Dewey published Psychology, the first American textbook on the revised subject. In 1895, he was invited to join the faculty of the Rockefeller Endowed University of Chicago as head of the Department of Philosophy, Psychology, and Pedagogy. That same year, the university allocated $1,000 to establish an educational laboratory in which Dewey could apply psychological principles and experimental techniques to the study of learning. The laboratory opened in January 1896 as the Dewey School, later to become known as the Laboratory School of the University of Chicago. For Dewey, the school was a place where the theories of education could be put into practice, tested, and scientifically evaluated. Dewey sought to apply the doctrines of experience and experiment to everyday life, and hence to education, seeking via this model institution to pave the way for the schools of the future. There he had put into actual practice three of his revolutionary beliefs he had called from the new psychology: that to put the child in possession of his fullest talents, education should be active rather than passive; that to prepare the child for a democratic society, the school should be social rather than individualistic; and that to enable the child to think creatively, experimentation rather than imitation should be encouraged. This was a sharp break from the traditional definition of education. In Dewey's own words, education consists either in the ability to use one's power in a social direction, or else an ability to share in the experience of others, and thus widen the individual consciousness to that of the race. The ultimate problem of all education is to coordinate the psychological and social factors. The coordination demands that the child be capable of expressing himself, but in such a way as to realize social ends. Although today Dewey's views are in practice in the great majority of American schools, before the turn of the century they were revolutionary. The Wundtian redefinition of education to mean feeding experimental data to a young brain and nervous system rather than teaching of mental skills led to the abdiction of the traditional role of the teacher as educator. Its place was taken by the concept of the teacher as a guide in the socialization of the child, leading each youngster to adapt to the specific behavior required of him in order for him to get along in his group. Dewey called for a leveling of individual differences into a common pool of students, who are the object of learning technicians devising the social order of the future. According to Professor Mort and Vincent of Columbia Teachers College, John Dewey was a culminating theorist in 3 centuries of educational writing. To Dewey, as to Wundt, man was an animal, along with his reactions, and entirely dependent upon experimental data. He believed that learning occurred only through experience, that the stimulus response mechanism was basic to learning, and that teachers were not instructors but designers of learning experiences. At the Dewey School in Chicago and later at Teachers College of Columbia University, Dewey was able to implement and promote the interchangeability of psychology and education successfully enough to become the leading figure in American education. Yet Dewey, the father of American education, was only one of the practitioners of once revised psychology who critically transformed American education and consequently American life. And at that point, that's why I'm going to venture into something else, because I don't think anything else needs to be explained about what happened to American education. This is pretty plain and simple. At least I'm going to leave this book alone for a little bit, and I'll revisit it, like, for sure. There are some things in this book that still need to be talked about, discussed, and we're going to go over them.